Hello and welcome to Console Shock, retro and modern gaming chat with me, Trev, and actually not Stu this time. Stu is actually on holiday, so he likes to pick cheap times of the year to go on holiday, and that's normally Christmas time. So he's not with us today, but we have reached into the Console Shock, well, past, but obviously has been present as well. And Al is joining us today. So thank you very much for filling Stu's gap, Al. How you doing?
I'm doing very well. I am certainly minding the gap, but
you really should.
I have returned.
Stu's gap could be a bit dangerous, so I do recommend minding it. Definitely needs some minding. But you've been on loads, in the recent sort of last year or two, actually.
So loads now.
Yeah, I know. Obviously, I think everybody knows the story now. You're one of the OGs. In fact, if we're being super specific, it's basically started off with me and you.
Yeah.
And now, we had obviously you moved away and from the UK to Canada, and then me and Stu kind of kept it going in this audio form, and then we got in touch with each other again to jump on our other podcast, or what has also now been going for a couple of years, which is kind of insane to think in itself. And at the same time, we thought, well, we're already doing this new podcast together. You should jump on our old one, as a guest as a co-presenter. When we feel it'll work out. And this is one of those times. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us again.
Always good to be back. And, I'm so proud. It's still going after all this time. I do remember because we'd done, I think, like 3 episodes at the time. And I remember sort of going to you and going, so there's been an altercation. I'm going to be leaving and moving to Canada. Surprise!
Yeah, trying to put a lid on it.
Just like, so we it's almost one of those, it's going to stop pretty much as soon as we started. And I still remember thinking, like, I don't know how we're going to do this remotely, because we started as a YouTube channel. That's the thing. We were doing video initially.
Basically,
So like, how are we going to do this remotely? And I didn't know what life was going to be like for me when I landed here, what time I would have. So I didn't want to set any expectations or promises.
Yeah.
So it was a bit of a wrap up, really. But I'm so glad that you and Stu, because we partnered with Stu with their store.
Yeah, that's right.
And, I'm so glad that you guys managed to continue it on in some form in the way of a podcast. It's willingly, and it makes it easier for me to come back on than if it was still being done as video. So
yeah, I mean, you're on our last episode a few weeks ago when the 3 of us were on, so it's a fairly semi-regular occurrence now. It's like 2 in a row, in fact. You've been on, so which is great. But yeah, I think the fact that it's a fairly straightforward thing that we've managed to get going, of just we just use some streaming software and we just jump on the stream. There's very little editing needed, apart from I tend to put some music at the start and the end of the episode just to bookend it nicely, and that's been going on for a few years now where I've done that. Can be a rod for our backs a little bit, because I've got to try and think of a bit of video game or sometimes just pop culture music. I mean, we don't make any money or try to make any money from the podcast, so I'll probably take a few liberties with some music that might be of dubious copyright status. But I don't think anybody's going to be chasing us to claim any money that we're not making from this. So I think it's working out fine. But it's obviously great to have you back on. But we could start off, I think, with we had a kind of a chat actually before we hit the record button, talking about what we've been doing and playing lately. And you got kind of a slightly funny sort of Steam send out like I think in email form a lot of the time, but also when you log into Steam, I think it gives you a thing at the end of each year saying, here's what you played this year as your 20XX, whatever it is, year review. And you got yours, and it was kind of funny.
Yeah, it just says, Alistair's Steam year in review 2023. And then right underneath it says, you focused entirely on one game this year.
Yeah.
And it was No Man's Sky. It was 100% of my total playtime, obviously. And it was for 3 sessions played over 2 days.
Yeah.
And it was a 2-day streak, so it was back to back.
Yeah. How many hours did it? Do you remember how many hours it was?
It doesn't say. I actually, it might do. I'm just looking at a screenshot for it here. If you bear me 1 second, I might be able to figure that out.
I don't think I've looked at mine yet. I don't think it's come through yet. Or if I go on my Steam Deck, it might be something on there that they deliver to that as well. So I guess it'll be something like FIFA, something really boring. Probably what I've ended up playing the most. So yeah. To be fair, you can figure out yourself in your Steam library. You can sort by hours played, and you can figure out how long you've been playing games that way as well.
That's true. That is true. Yeah. It is. Let's see. I've loaded it up again here. I got 2 achievements as well.
Well done.
Yep. 0% were new games. I had 1 badge, and yeah, it doesn't look like it says how much. I'd have to log into Steam properly and see that.
Indeed.
But it was just a couple of days worth, so not much. But yeah, I was doing that, but and really liked actually going back to No Man's Sky because I played it when it initially came out, and I lost access to the system I was playing it on, so I wasn't able to play it again for ages. So all the new updates that they had, I didn't get to play a single new update. It was always just the original version I played, which I surprisingly enjoyed. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I thought for what it was, if you ignore everything else that was going on at the time, all the stuff from Hello Games and everybody hyping it up for themselves to be grander than what was released. When you looked at the game just as it was, I actually thought it was quite good. And playing it now where there's base building, there's a third-person view, there's vehicles, there's so much more that they've added to it, and it's an incredible change to everything.
I think they kind of, I mean, I don't know if they really overpromised, but I think it got built up a lot, one way or another, whether that was, the people that were going to buy it or felt they wanted to buy it versus what was actually being announced. But it's probably only really in the last year or two that it's kind of lived up to that. And it's a great game now. I mean, I haven't dived back into it myself either. I have played it. There was a little spell of a few days where I had it not long after it came out. I like space exploration and sort of trading games like Frontier Elite. I played Elite Dangerous a lot, and probably that kind of burnt me out on that sort of genre a little bit when I played a lot of Elite Dangerous. I've still got it. I could play it. I've actually played it a bit on my Steam Deck. Elite Dangerous, which is very cool playing a game of that scope on a handheld. But it works fine on the Steam Deck as well. But it is, I guess, a 10-year-old game now. Wow, that went by quick. No Man's Sky, No Man's Sky obviously was shortly after Elite Dangerous, but those games are often great. Now we've got obviously Starfield, which I haven't actually touched because the feedback I'm hearing about it is very mixed. But it's one that I might dive into at some point because everyone says it's a lot better now, but they're such time sinks, those games. I'm not sure.
That's why I only got like 2 days out of it because I especially around that point I was getting really busy because there was our other podcast, Long Range Sensors, shameless plug. And there was I was trying to get back into streaming Minecraft on Twitch, and then I've also had a little bit of a side passion project that I've been trying to focus on that's taken up a lot of my free time, all dealing with nostalgic stuff. So no doubt there'll be articles. It's a website with written articles about stuff. So there'll be stuff about old vintage handhelds and games on there as well. As a little bit of a side project thing. So yeah. So that's kind of what I've been working on, and that's just meant that for something like No Man's Sky, it's like big game. I want to be able to sink my teeth into it, just not right now.
Yeah. To be honest, like in terms of what I've actually been playing, I mean, really, it's been old stuff. The last couple of days, I dug out my Mega Drive. And I've just been playing with the Mega EverDrive Pro, which I've had for a little while, just been playing games on that. I think the last game I played was probably Sunset Riders, which is a Konami run and gun game, which I freaking love.
I've done it in a long time.
Sunset Riders is great. It was an arcade machine. Back in the day, it got ported to the Super Nintendo and the Mega Drive, but the Mega Drive got a not as good conversion, unfortunately. It's still good. The main reason or the main issue with it is it's on a 4 megabit cart, which is very small, even by Mega Drive standards. and you're more likely to see cartridges of that size on literally the Master System and the NES and things like that. That would be fairly big for an NES game. But the Super Nintendo got an 8 megabit cart. The arcade, I think, was 16 megabits, so neither were as big as that. But obviously, the Mega Drive had to be sort of very cleverly squeezed onto that smaller cart. So there was some cuts, and there was some they kind of rejigged the game. Really, it's like Turtles Hyperstone on the Mega Drive versus Turtles in Time on the Super Nintendo, where they were kind of limited. So they basically kind of made a new game, but with the same elements of Turtles in Time. So that's what they did with Sunset Riders. The levels are sort of chopped up and moved around, and there's the 2 less characters you can play as. So it's not as good, but it's still really, really good fun. But there is someone called Pyron is trying to remake it. They're making a Sunset Riders arcade edition for the Mega Drive. So you can check that out on YouTube, and it looks freaking amazing. It looks basically arcade perfect. It looks absolutely incredible. So if you're into Sunset, there are other games that these guys remake as well for the Mega Drive where there's a slightly janky original version and they've redone it. So check out Pyron. But yeah, he's doing a new version of that game. So it's very cool. Also, there's another shout out to a sort of a homebrew remake of a game, Mortal Kombat Arcade Edition on the Mega Drive. Is freaking amazing as well. Again, another homebrew project. I can't remember who put it together, but it's basically the Mega Drive Mortal Kombat was pretty good. Obviously not quite, it wasn't arcade perfect. So obviously the Mega Drive hardware is limited versus what the original arcade was on. But God, what these guys have done with the remake that they've done, it's got all the sound, all the voice samples are all back in. It's just the music is in the right order. The music sounds better, high quality samples. More frames of animation. They've corrected some frames where you had Sub-Zero's standing animation was the same as Scorpion's in the original, but they've now corrected that, so he has his own unique stance. And yeah, just giving it a facelift, and it's probably the best 16-bit version of that game now by a mile.
Nice. I used to play it on the Mega Drive so much because just to have an arcade experience like that in the home, like you said, it was never words are hard. It's never nearly as good, but the fact that it was there and as good as it was phenomenal. Since getting my arcade 1-up cabinet that has the first 3 Mortal Kombat games on it, and it's styled as a Mortal Kombat cabinet. I maybe it sounds elitist, but I can't go back to the Mega Drive version.
Hard, isn't it?
Because it's you instantly feel like there's a bit of nostalgia that comes back when I go back to play the Mega Drive version. It's like, okay, this does feel as I remember it, but at the same time, it was
a bit of a drop for sure.
You feel the downgrade in a way that you didn't back in the day when it was advanced for what you got in the home. So I'm spoiled by my arcade machines, basically.
And there was the original Mega Drive version, which obviously had a lot of cuts, as we've just said. But there was a Mega CD version of Mortal Kombat as well, which was a little bit better.
I never played that one.
No, I mean I've played that quite a lot. It had the original arcade music was in the game basically as a PCM CD tracks. So the Mega Drive wasn't generating that music, but it was just basically sounded identical because it's coming from the CD, recorded from the arcade machine. Although they're in the wrong order. Toasty as always is one of the best things. Well, they didn't come into Mortal Kombat 2, but that soundtrack obviously the original Mega Drive soundtrack was pretty cool actually in itself. But yeah, it was good to have that arcade music in there, but the music we played on the wrong stages, so that was sort of a bone of contention with a lot of people. There was other things like when it would announce who won the round, like Scorpion wins, it wouldn't do it on the first round, it would do it on the final round of a match, which is a bit weird. Don't really know why it was doing that. And also there was loading times, which weren't terrible leading into a battle, but when you got to like Shang Tsung, it would literally pause to load whenever he morphed into someone. So that kind of breaks that final battle with Shang Tsung, unfortunately, on the Mega CD.
I can see that being unfortunate.
Yeah, and I think it would pause briefly when you performed a fatality as well, because there was probably unique animations that had to be streamed into the game off the CD. So, but that isn't too bad. Obviously, that's not really a gameplay affecting issue, that is. But so yeah, that was a bit of a janky port as well, but pretty decent for the time. Then there was the Super Nintendo, obviously famous for not having the blood, and actually it looked a lot better than the Mega Drive, closer to the arcade, but controlled horribly. Very laggy controls, which kind of kills it for me, really, as being a viable, way of playing the game back in the day.
Yeah, and I still remember being a kid and just thinking that the fact that it looked like dust coming off of people.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
Sweat or dust off the shoulder kind of thing. It was never as good as the blood. Like, you didn't see it as kind of as violent as the news were trying to make it out. Like, there's ultra violent game stuff, but it's just kind of like to see blood in a game. Like, it didn't look realistic at all. You knew it was kind of cartoony violence. But it was so cool, just the fact that there was blood, which was something we just did not see in games really until then. And that's where the Mega Drive really kind of reigned supreme. Plus, Sega had a much bigger foothold in the UK than it did in, say, North America. So I remember most of my friends all having Mega Drives and having Mortal Kombat. And there was only like one person I knew with a Super Nintendo. So I got to see it, but it wasn't really the version that we were all playing.
Yeah, I mean, I always argue in favor of the Mega Drive when it comes to like sales and like stuff and things like that, because I think it had a disadvantage in the fact that ultimately the Super Nintendo won that generation in terms of sales, but really the Mega Drive had a handicap from day one because Sega consoles never sell well in Japan. The Saturn was probably their most successful out of all the Sega consoles. The Mega Drive wasn't successful at all in Japan. So it's missing out on, dozens, a few tens of millions of units that it didn't get, whereas the Super Nintendo did get that. Had it been a moderate success in Japan, you might have found that the Mega Drive would have ended up neck and neck or potentially beating the Super Nintendo in worldwide sales. Because obviously Europe and America, North America and South America, particularly Brazil, were very strong in terms of Sega.
Brazil, especially with the Master System, which was going on for years, decades after.
I think they're still producing variants of the Master System to this day.
Probably wouldn't surprise me. I know it's been like decades that they've been doing it. It's just such a phenomenal success there.
Yeah. And in terms of Sega, that kind of brings us on to the main topic of today's show. So, for some reason in my head, I thought we'd covered this system, and we kind of did. So, we're going to chat about the Sega Game Gear. Now, we covered the Game Boy a long, long time ago, actually, in kind of the early-ish sort of era of this podcast. And we actually had like a general handhelds episode that we did a couple of years ago, I think, where we kind of talked about all of them and how they kind of, battled each other in kind of the console wars. It was kind of a mini handheld war that was separate from the sort of the Mega Drive v Super Nintendo war. But the Game Gear we haven't actually covered separately. The Lynx also we've also covered in a separate episode. Game Boy Advance versus PSP we've done as well. The Vita v the 3DS. So we've touched upon a lot of the other sort of famous handhelds, but the Game Gear weirdly is one that we've never talked about. And actually it's double weird because it was probably my favorite of that generation. And probably one of my, it'd probably go in my top 10 favorite systems of all time.
I think you're saving the best till last, right? That's...
Oh, yeah. That must be it. That's probably just subconsciously.
It's all built up to this moment, Trev.
Yeah. So yeah, we're going to have a little chat about the Sega Game Gear. So, I mean, what initial sort of thoughts and feelings come to your mind when you think about the Sega Game Gear?
Well, I never owned one. I was never that fortunate. I was the kid that was always a generation behind on everything. So I had the Master System when everybody had a Mega Drive.
Me too, to a degree. Yeah, absolutely.
As people moved on, then I got my Mega Drive. But I did have a few friends who had a Game Gear, and so I did get quite a lot of hands-on playtime with it. And it's one of those. I wouldn't call it love-hate. That's wrong. That's not the best way to describe it. But it was one of those things where I loved the design. It was a lot larger than the Game Boy. And the Game Boy was tall, whereas the Game Gear was wide. So you held it in a different way, and it felt comfortable doing so. But you could tell that as advanced as it was with its color screen, there was definitely drawbacks to some of the things that they were putting forward. And really, this is where I think that although Sega had a foothold when it came to consoles, I think that Nintendo really got it with the handhelds, and we'll probably lean more into it. But things like battery life was just like the big thing for that.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I think that was the deciding factor, really, in many ways. But the Game Gear certainly wasn't a failure. It kind of did carve its own niche.
No.
I mean, it lasted, several years, really, in the end. It was released initially in Japan in 1990, in October. We got it a little bit later than that. We got it in June of 1991.
Yeah.
So we got it a few months later, but they supported it until 1997. So it had a fairly long life. When you compare that to the other systems that the Game Boy took on, the Lynx was pretty much dead I'd say by about 1994.
Yeah, I'd say the Lynx was the failure.
Big time, yeah. You could definitely say that was a failure. There was obviously the PC Engine GT. You could call it a failure, although it wasn't strictly, because it wasn't a single platform. It was a handheld version of the PC Engine, or the Turbo Graphics, as it's called in North America.
Yeah.
But the Turbo Graphics, obviously in America, wasn't successful. But in Japan, the PC Engine was very successful. The handheld, it was just a handheld variant, which is very cool, to have a handheld version of a home console. Obviously, the Mega Drive would end up having the Sega Nomad eventually as a handheld Mega Drive, but very, very late in its life.
And I think that's a big thing as well, is that you had the Game Boy, which was its own system, where games had to be made purely for it. But as you alluded to, this was a console. This was the Master System in a portable form, which
basically
was nuts. That was crazy. With a few hardware differences, like it had a much larger color palette, and it could draw from more colors as well than the Master System could, which meant it was backwards compatible. You could get an adapter for the back that allowed you to plug in actual Master System cartridges and play them on there.
Yeah.
But you couldn't go the other way. Whereas with Nintendo, they built an adapter so you could play your Game Boy games on the Super Game Boy Advance. I think no, Super Game Boy.
Super Game Boy, yeah.
Just Super Game Boy, wasn't it? That was it. Yeah, it's just called Super Game Boy. So you could do that, but with the Game Gear, it was one way.
Yeah, because of that palette difference, the Master System couldn't replicate a lot of the colors that the Game Gear could sort of splash on its screen, and that was the thing for me. My personal experience, I had a Game Gear, but I think I had a friend of mine, a really good friend when I was in primary school. And I don't know if I was about to get a Game Boy at this point, or I was a few months away from it. But I remember he had a Game Gear. This would have been around 1992, I think. So, within its first year of being out in the UK anyway. And I'd already, played Game Boys, and, whether that was around friends' houses or in kiosks in Dixon's or Curry's or whatever, where they had their game zone areas. They always had like a handheld sort of unit that often had all of them out. I remember distinctly remembering one that would have a Game Gear, a Game Boy, and an Atari Lynx. I remember even going in a Stansted Airport. There was a Dixon's concession in there, and I remember playing Sonic 2 on the Game Gear that they had in there. It was very, locked into like a sort of a thing that would protrude out of a desk, and it was kind of stuck out, of like an arm, and then it was sort of locked in. But you could still play it. Obviously, they obviously saw a lot of action, so they were very scuffed and a bit worse for wear.
Yeah, but it's just a kind of vice-like grip around the actual handheld. So it was all in a fixed position. There was always a little bit of movement that you could get from it.
That's right. Yeah,
it wasn't completely rigid. There was still like a little bit of flex for you to sort of move it slightly, but not by much.
Yeah, so there was a fairly significant presence in the UK of the Game Gear in shops. It often have its own little section, with a selection of games. Not too, fairly similarly sized to what I recall of the Game Boy being, in terms of how it was pushed in terms of shops itself. But
Yeah.
Yeah, getting back to sort of playing on my friend's Game Gear, I remember playing it for the first time, and I thought, wow, this makes the Game Boy look like crap. It was like, it looked like the thing for me was, it looked like the games that you would get on like the full-blown home consoles. The games looked like that. Whereas the Game Boy almost like was closer to a Tiger LCD handheld or a Konami LCD handheld because it was black and white or yellow or green and black, yellow and black. Even though that isn't the case, obviously the Game Boy is very similar in terms of spec to the Game Gear. It's only really the screen where there's a clear, differentiation in terms of the specs. Obviously, you can talk about battery life and everything separately, but yeah. But that's how in my sort of 8-year-old, 9-year-old mind, that was how that's how they appeared in terms of how different they were. Yeah. So instantly the Game Boy just looked like crap to me. But awkwardly, I got one Game Boy for Christmas. I loved it. I still love playing it. But I think I always wanted a Game Gear because I would always go to this mate's house and play his Game Gear, go into these shops and there'd be the kiosks that would have Game Gear set up, and I would always play that versus all. I would ignore the others. And eventually I did get one for the following Christmas in 1993. So again, very, very deep into its lifespan. I mean, I only really had a couple of years left really at that point in it. But
it's interesting you say that as well, because I have a copy of the Argos catalog from Christmas of 93.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Right with you now?
Right now, yes. Do you know how much it cost back then?
I do recall it was definitely more than the Game Boy. The Game Boy, I think, was about £70 with a game with Tetris.
Actually, a lot less. With Tetris, it was £50. It was $49.99.
Wow, I didn't even realize that dropped a lot in that sort of from about 92 when I had my Game Boy to 93. Yeah.
Now, bearing in mind that using the Bank of England's website with their inflation calculator, £50 back in 1993 was £102.58.
Not too bad though for a full-blown handheld console. Yeah.
So you're looking at about £100 of today's money.
Yeah,
which is.
I mean, realistically,
Canadian, and for US dollars, that would work out to about $126.
When you say that, the equivalent now is a Switch, and that's a lot more expensive than that.
Yeah.
So that's a really good price.
Yeah, and so for the Game Gear, whereas you're looking at £50 with Tetris, the Game Gear was £97.50.
Yowzers.
Yeah. Now, with that, they had an offer at the time, actually pretty good. You got a money off software voucher for up to £20.
Oh, cool.
Off any video game bought
at Argos. Games are like £40-50, so that was a huge chunk. Yeah.
That was, yeah. So around that time as well, like Game Gear games, Sonic 2 was £28. You were looking at £30 for Mickey Mouse 2, £30 for Jurassic Park as well. You had some that were a little bit cheaper, like Space Harrier was $15.
They were generally priced cheaper than like Mega Drive games, for example. They'd be about £20 less. A Mega Drive game could run you about £50-60, whereas a Game Gear game would be like Mortal Kombat on the Mega Drive would be £55 or something. The Game Gear version would be about $35. Yeah.
Yeah. But I thought it was interesting kind of just looking through the old Argos catalog and just kind of seeing what some of the prices were. I mean, a Master System, that was with Sonic the Hedgehog 2 included and bundled in, that was $49.50. And if you wanted it with Alex Kidd bundled in, this was the Master System 2. Not the original Master System. So it would come bundled in with one of those two games. So with Alex Kidd, you got a bit of a discount at £39. So
that's pretty good.
Yeah. So amazing. When you're going portable with a built-in screen, obviously the Game Gear is going to be more. But to think that it was kind of more than double the price.
Yeah, I mean, was that £99 without a game? That's just the unit, effectively.
Well, that's the unit, and the Master System 2 had, like, if you didn't have a cartridge in, it would boot up with either Alex Kidd or Sonic the Hedgehog, the original one. So depending on which model you got, when I was growing up, I had the Alex Kidd model. That
was the most common, I would say. Yeah, the game ROM was like part of the main board of the unit. Yeah, which was kind of unique. Yeah.
The original Master System even had a maze game built in that was kind of a hidden.
Yes, it was. Yeah,
I think it was Hang On was the built-in ROM, but then there was just a second hidden one that was a maze game.
Well, the Master System had that sort of boot screen, didn't it? With the Master System logo would come up, and that got taken out. By the time we got to the Master System 2, it just went into the game, or the Sega logo would appear, But yeah, at that time, obviously the Master System, you're looking at it was probably in its last year, really. When you got to 1993 of its life, I don't think there would have been many releases in 1994 for it.
Yeah, it had already been discontinued in the US. And we had it still going because the Master System was still going pretty strong in our market. And I think that's also because games on consoles were quite expensive compared to desktop counterparts like the Commodore Amiga and PC. And so we were so used to games being quite cheap and affordable that budget ones like the Master System continued on. So Sonic 2 came out on the Master System in the UK, never came out on the Master System in the US.
No.
So their only experience with it was on the Game Gear.
Yes, and I think the last Master System game in the US was Sonic 1. And that's what you're looking at 1991, really. And I think what they got, you might have seen these, I guess, in your travels in Canada. I think they just got the European cartridge, the actual European release, shipped over to them. They just put a sticker over the UPC. And obviously,
just on the outer packaging,
and it'll just play in 60 hertz, without needing any switching or anything. The code will just be a bit faster. It'll just run a bit faster,
Oh, life before region locks.
Indeed. You could easily not bother releasing a game, but just bring over the other region's version. Yeah. So yeah, it was interesting with that. So a lot of the Master System, there was a lot of crossover between the Master System and the Game Gear. There are a lot of games that got a Master System release over here that in North America you would have only seen the Game Gear version. Sports games being a good example, and the Sonic games, as you say, things like Mortal Kombat. They would never have seen the European Mortal Kombat Master System versions. We got Mortal Kombat 1 and 2 came out on the Master System here. Whereas in America, it was just the Game Gear releases that you would have seen there, yeah.
And there's three types of games for the Game Gear as well. And I don't mean like genres or anything, but you had games that were built for the Game Gear. They were Game Gear exclusive, only ever available there. There was then ports. So Sonic 2 is a perfect example of that, where they took the Master System game and they shrunk it down. So they kind of cropped in so that characters would appear larger. They also moved where the UI elements were, like the ring count of how many rings you're picking up, that would be made larger and obviously fit within the screen. And that had mixed responses because with Sonic 2, with the speed you were going, you weren't seeing dangers that were ahead that on the Master System version you would have.
Yes.
Because everything's flying by far too quickly. So it makes it more challenging, but not in a fun way. You almost kind of getting penalized for the thing you didn't see coming.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a much easier game to play on the Master System because, as you said, there's basically a screen crunch that occurs with the slight dip in resolution. The Master System would have a much wider resolution than the Game Gear.
That's right. Yeah. And it's like there's people who've kind of gotten the ROMs and you can expand the playing area so you can actually see, like, is there everything else outside of those bounds? Then yes, it was ported from the Master System. And then we've got ones that were for the Master System and it's basically just kind of squashed in. And so there's a little bit of letterboxing and the start button, which didn't exist on a Master System. You had a 1 button and a 2 button. The 1 doubled as start, and the console had a pause button.
Yeah, on the actual unit.
Yeah, but this one had an actual start button. So if you were at the titles for a game and you hit start, then it would take you into the game. If it was a Master System port with no changes, then that start button did nothing. You had to sit through the whole thing, or you had to hit the 1 button to do it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, normally it would just be mapped to 1, wouldn't it? That would do that same thing. Yeah, so very, very frustrating playing a Master System when you need to pause because you've got to literally get up and walk over to the unit and hit the pause button. That wasn't wisely. They added the start button on the Game Gear when it was designed.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just
Although that was back in the day when you would have your TV, you would have your console, but your console wouldn't necessarily always be under the TV. You'd sometimes pull the console out halfway across the room.
that's right.
And
Yeah,
then you would sit directly in front of the console for that reason.
yeah.
You know,
A lot of the time, you potentially would be sat on the floor, as a little kid with the console in front of you,
yeah,
with the controller then plugged into a big old CRT or even a small one, if it was in your bedroom or something. So you could argue it wasn't really an issue. That it was. I feel like when we got to sort of, well, to be honest, it was probably like that for a long time. I can imagine playing. I mean, I was a lot older when like the PS1 came out, but I was still on the end of my bed with the TV on a cabinet in front of my bed. With the controller cable coming out, the console on top of the TV, sort of thing. Probably people still do that now. Really, the controller's just wireless. Yeah,
I remember having that where there was only one place I could put my Mega Drive when I was at university, and that was on top of the television, and that was really annoying because of the cables. So I managed to source the infrared controllers, which were great as long as you were pointing them at the TV. If you moved them slightly, so if you're kind of in the middle of things, or you just move slightly just out of a knee-jerk reaction to what's happening in the game, then you lose your input. So
yeah, you needed that line of sight. Yeah,
so it's like, do you want cables dangling in front of the screen, or do you want to just be laser focused on making sure that you're not losing line of sight for your infrared?
Yeah, that isn't so much of an issue nowadays. Obviously, you've got like 8-bit Go controllers, haven't you, for the Mega Drive, and and obviously the really good. There's the official sort of retro bit Sega controllers now that actually look exactly like the original sort of Mega Drive controllers that are wireless as well.
We're spoiled now. We are.
So we're very much spoiled with these wireless controllers, but also you could use a Mega Drive controller in a Master System as well. Although you could use the start button to pause, unfortunately, but very handy if you had both consoles. But in that era, you probably would just get a Master System converter for your Mega Drive, and you could just play them through that.
Those 9-pin ports were really common though, because they were even on the Commodore.
Oh yeah.
You could even use a Master System controller on the Commodore 64, which I did. I even had the joystick. I forgot what they called it for the Master System, but I did have that joystick that they had as well. And
like the quick shot joystick.
So there's a lot of cross compatibility there, which was really impressive.
Really handy. But it's an interesting point about the ports and not compensating for the Game Gear's smaller screen. There's good examples of when that's done well. I mean, you can look at the Game Boy and something like Super Mario Land. The sprites are very small, which means you've got like basically a similar, wide angle of view that you would have on like Mario on the NES, because they reduced those. But then you went to Super Mario Land, where you had a huge Mario sprite that was kind of more akin to Super Mario World, really. But because that was a game that was developed with the Game Boy in mind, they sort of made sure Mario was kind of closer to the left side of the screen. So you have kind of a nice, clear sort of view of the path in front of you. And the levels would be designed with that in mind as well. So you wouldn't have, you could just jump to your death because you couldn't see what was coming up next. You never really felt that with a game like Super Mario Land 2.
Yeah.
But yeah, those sort of cross-platform, multi-plat Master System Game Gear games, you would have that. And sometimes it would be okay. Like there's examples like Streets of Rage there's examples where it seems like the game was developed for the Game Gear, first, and then ported to the Master System. Like something like Streets of Rage 2, where it has very small sprites that you kind of are about the right proportion for a Game Gear screen, but you sort of play it on a Master System, the same game, the Master System version, which is basically a port of the Game Gear, and it just, the sprites look tiny, especially when you compare it to like the first Streets of Rage, where the Master System got a unique version, as did the Game Gear got a unique version. So that needed to happen. And then there was later Sonic games, though, like you had Sonic Chaos, which probably was developed first for the Game Gear and then got ported to the Master System. That is a little bit better with the screen crunch. It's not really a big issue. That was the first Sonic game I played, in fact, was Sonic Chaos.
Oh, right. Okay.
On the Game Gear, yeah.
Yeah, I did end up getting that. I never played it on the Game Gear, but I did have that on the Master System.
Yeah, that was I got that with my Game Gear that Christmas, so it was amazing.
Oh, right.
A solid game to play straight away. And I got I think it was my grandparents that actually got me the Game Gear, but it was bundled with Mine was a bundle. It came with like a 4-in-1 game pack called the Sega Game Pack 4-in-1.
I was wondering because I was looking at because even the 92 Argos catalog, and I think even in this one, even on the Christmas, it just says with 4 games, but it doesn't say what those are. It just says with columns and 3 additional games.
So that was probably the one, yeah.
Yeah. So what were the games that you had on that one? Do you remember?
So columns was one, and columns obviously was kind of obviously there was a Mega Drive version of that game, but it was very much a way of getting kind of a Tetris type game onto the Game Gear. And it was a decent game, sort of just things. I think gem matching games are kind of more popular than your Tetris sort of type game these days, weirdly, with mobile phones and the games that you play on those. But you had that. And there was a penalty shootout game where it was a football game, but there was no football match. You just did a penalty shootout.
Oh, I had a Tiger Electronics game that was like that.
Yeah. Quite a limited game, but also kind of fun. But you weren't. There was you didn't pick a team or anything. It was just you versus the computer to win a penalty shootout.
Yeah.
There was a rally game, which I can't remember the name of it, but it was basically almost like kind of very similar to Outrun, where you just basically try and go through a course, race through a course, and you basically weren't trying to actually finish first or anything. You were basically trying to beat the clock. So very much like Outrun. So there was the rally game, and then there was also a tennis game that was really, really good. It was probably the best game on it. It was very much like Super Tennis on the Super Nintendo. A really, really good tennis game that was very fun.
Yeah, you know what? That's given that. I mean, it's fine. It's got something like penalty shootout and things and stuff. But as like an all-rounder, that's not a bad collection. That is enough variety that if this is your first handheld, there's probably at least one game that you'll like.
Yeah, I mean, there isn't a huge amount of depth probably to the games.
No, I mean,
but yeah, I mean,
it's typical of handhelds anyway, and it was way more than you would get with like the Tiger Electronics.
Time. So I mean, Columns was largely the same as the separate Columns game, so that's a lot of people could spend days playing that, years playing it really. Penalty shootout, you're not really going to be in that be doing that for hours. But the tennis game's pretty good. Sonic was actually the umpire as well, which was fun to see. Much like Mario's the umpire in the.
Oh, I've seen screenshots of that. Yes, I know which one you're talking about now. Yes.
Yeah. Looking at the entry for it on Sega Retro was called Championship Tennis. And you basically went through a gauntlet of facing harder and harder opponents in like a tournament. I don't think I ever got to complete it, but it was actually quite a fun tennis game. And the racing game was Pan American Road Rally. It was just like I say, reaching checkpoints very much like Outrun. So that was pretty decent to keep you going. That would keep you going for a few months until you got another game. But I was lucky enough to get Sonic Chaos, so I was able to play that. And over the years, obviously, I got more games. I remember one. I think probably the best game out of the ones that I owned back in the day was probably Shinobi. There was a Game Gear specific Shinobi called GG Shinobi. That was an amazing platformer that was unique to the Game Gear. Very much like the Mega Drive Shinobi games, like Revenge of Shinobi and Shinobi 3, but a unique Game Gear adventure and well worth checking out.
I think it was like a cross between. I might be confusing this with something else, but I think it was like a cross between the kind of standard platformer that it would have, but it also had a bit of a top-down RPG style Zelda-like view.
That was Axe Battler, I think.
You're right. Yes, no, that was Axe Battler. Yes,
which is basically Golden Axe, but it isn't Golden Axe because she's not a scrolling beat 'em up.
Axe Battler was the main character from that series.
Yes,
so
it was basically Zelda 2. Where you had the overhead bits and then the sort of side-scrolling bits. That was Axe Battler. That was a unique Game Gear game as well. Yeah, basically an RPG. And there was obviously then the Wonder Boy games, which are also on the Master System. Dragon's Trap was probably the one most people would associate with the Game Gear, which was an RPG, platformer RPG. Still a really great game to this day. Got a great remake. Got about 10 years ago now. Dragon's Trap, which you can get on Steam and all kinds of. I think it came out on PS4 and Xbox and everything, and Switch. But the original was on the Master System and the Game Gear. And I remember playing Mortal Kombat on the Game Gear. And that was a pretty good port. It had blood in it, of course.
It was a lot better than the Game Boy port. The Game Boy one was kind of atrocious. It's just
was.
Even the frame rate just wasn't there, whereas the Game Gear was certainly able to handle that a lot better.
Had much larger sprites, and I think watching a really great Digital Foundry DF Retro episode where John on there does a deep dive into Mortal Kombat, and he goes through all the ports, and he gets to the Game Gear, and they actually use background tiles to actually build the characters sprites. They're not sprites because they're not using sprites to build the characters, but the background tiles were actually used for the characters, which is why it does have that slightly jankier, jerkier, slower frame rate. Still better than how they managed it on the Game Boy, but it meant you got these huge, impressive-looking sprites that took up most of the Game Gear screen on the port of Mortal Kombat. And they did the same again for Mortal Kombat 2, which is also fairly good on the Game Gear.
Yeah.
The library, obviously, there's all the Sonic games, Sonic 1, 2, Chaos, Triple Trouble, which I didn't play a lot of, but was a completely unique to the Game Gear game.
Yeah, especially it had Tails involved.
It did, yes. Tails had his own game as well called Tails Adventure.
Yes, first time you could play Tails single player.
Yes. Yeah, and incidentally, actually, I think Sonic 2 on the Game Gear came out a few days before the Mega Drive game. So technically, it was Tails' first appearance was on the Master System and the Game Gear.
And it's interesting because the Sonic 2 for the Master System and Game Gear was so different not a port at all of the Mega Drive / Genesis version at all. It was almost like you had a part 1 and a part 2 because in the Master System version, that was when Sonic meets Tails. Tails sort of tells him that Abby's being captured, and then Tails gets captured as well. And you spend the whole game trying to rescue Tails. And then in the Mega Drive version, that's when Tails is now your buddy and you're going off together. But what was really interesting and weird to me growing up was, okay, so I'm supposed to be chasing Tails and trying to rescue him from Robotnik. But all the loading levels has photos of Sonic and Tails together. So like the first level you're in a minecart, and then the loading screen for it is Sonic and Tails both riding the minecart. So it's almost like they've been on an adventure together, and it's like their holiday snaps. And it's almost like he's just kind of going back, like just remembering the holiday snaps of, this is when we were last here.
Yeah.
But they hadn't met each other. So it was confusing as a child to be like, why? But I like the art. It was, and this is the thing, the colors on that artwork was brilliant. It looked great.
Yeah, and I think, there was a very weird sort of thing with Sonic 2 as well. Like, if you don't collect all the Chaos Emeralds, which are kind of hidden in each level, I think Tails gets murdered. Because you, complete the game without the Chaos Emeralds, and then Sonic just kind of looks up. The ending is just Sonic looking up to the sky, and you just have sort of Tails is kind of like an ethereal
in the stars.
Sort of in the stars. And I'm like, and you're like, have I not rescued him? Is he dead? It's like, well, Dr. Robotnik literally murders him.
So that's Tails constellation. Yeah.
So that's kind of crazy. Because I think the Chaos Emeralds are very difficult to pick up in that game.
Now, we've talked about like how good the colors are, the performance for things like Sonic and Mortal Kombat, obviously a lot better. And so this is where the screen has that kind of 50-50 positive, negative thing to it, because it was incredible that you could get all these colors. The resolution it was at was really good for a handheld. It was backlit, which had a lot going for it.
Yes, you in the dark.
That's it, compared to the Game Boy, which you couldn't. You needed a light overhead. But the refresh rate was not the best. I remember that when you're playing Sonic 2 at full speed, where you're running through the level, there is so much ghosting, there's so much blur, that you can kind of lose track as to what it is you're looking at.
Yeah, it's a passive matrix screen, so things persist, imagery persists from one frame to the next, and things like Sonic literally becomes a blur, as does the rest of the level as it's passing by you.
It's one of those things where all the technology within the Game Gear was great. Display technology was just too far behind.
Exactly, and it impacted the playability. I mean, I was okay with mine. You just got used to it, I think. But obviously, battery life was obviously a big negative for the Game Gear and the screen. It has to take responsibility for that as well.
Yeah, and I found out, especially when there's been a resurgence of people talking about Tetris with its anniversary that happened not too long ago.
Yeah,
that's when I found out that originally they were even looking at a color screen for the Game Boy, and that's when they opted not to because they knew that battery life would be terrible, that the screen technology was not up to what it needed to be, and that's why they went with their monochrome screen. And when you've got a Game Gear that requires 6 batteries versus the Game Boy's 4, and the battery life was abysmal. So you were churning through more of those sets of 6 batteries, whereas your friend with the Game Boy was still going on their initial set of 4. That was a massive game changer. The less you have to ask your parents for new batteries, typically the better.
And it was just big as well. I mean, you could argue that the way it's orientated in sort of a horizontal way, like you have the screen and the controls on either side, is basically how handhelds have continued to be built. Even down to the Steam Deck and the Switch. I'm not saying that the Game Gear invented that. You could argue it's really the Atari Lynx, which is came out before the Game Gear in '89. That was where that kind of landscape orientation.
Which you could twist around. You could be left-handed if you wanted to.
You could on the Atari Lynx, not something that the Game Gear could do at all. But that was a big disadvantage. Again, for me, it didn't really affect me too much because it was my main console and I had the power adapter. So I was happy just playing in my bedroom or in the living room, just plugged into the wall. I could do that all day long. I didn't really take it out with me.
That was the thing with my Lynx as well. I found I got an hour gameplay on battery, so it was just pointless. So
and it was too big. You couldn't put it in a pocket.
No. How is the Game Gear? Because you were telling me before the show that you've now got one, and I know that with my Game Boys that I now have, I can fit those in my jeans pockets, no problem. Like even the original bulky one. How is it with the Game Gear? Can you fit that in a pocket?
Hell no. So. Yeah, it's still too big to realistically take around with you. But you could also, I mean, to be honest, you could say the same about it's smaller than like a Steam Deck, which is probably the Steam Deck is thinner. But to be honest, you probably would treat it the same as you would a Steam Deck. And nowadays, you could obviously take it, put it in your backpack, and take it around with you in that way. You're not putting it in your back pocket like you would a PSP or an original Game Boy, which are genuinely small and can fit in your, although original Game Boy is a bit bulkier, but there are other handhelds that are genuinely small. I always say the Vita is about the perfect size for a handheld, but there's only so much tech you can cram into something that small, which is why a Steam Deck and a ROG Ally and a Legion Go and even the Switch, or the Switch Lite actually can fit in a pocket, a larger pocket, but it can. You're always limited with the tech there, but the Game Gear, it's more kind of you would throw it in your backpack, but you obviously could take it with you if you go on holiday, and you could get it out of your bag and play it wherever you're sat, but certainly not something you would just have in your back pocket to quickly get out when you're waiting for a train to land or something. It'd be a bit more tedious to do that as it would with the Steam Deck. But also, the great thing about what you could do with the Game Gear now, and as you mentioned, I've got a modded one, much like you can mod Game Boys. You can mod Game Gears now, and you can basically eliminate a lot of the issues that the original had. The big one being the screen. So you've modded handhelds yourself, mainly the Game Boy. Have you been looked into doing a Game Gear?
I have. I actually have a friend over in the UK that's got one, and she managed to dig it out, and it has died on her. And so it's one of those things where I'm going to be looking at seeing if I can get that all patched up for her again.
Cool.
So the big problem with them is that they had massive issues with capacitors. We're now getting to that point where if you have a Game Gear, the capacitors are probably gone, and if they haven't, and you're lucky, they're about to. It's pretty much a guarantee at this point. So there's
a lot of technology from the 90s that have capacitors. There was a particular sort of basically era when all that tech with those capacitors is dying. Amigas are affected.
So you pretty much have to recap them. There are kits online which you can get where you can just you open it up. The motherboard will have a revision number, and so you basically just select the revision number board that you have, and you can just order all the capacitors rather than having to find each one individually. You can just get them as a set to recap if you have soldering skills. There's also, as I imagine, yours probably has like a new, probably an IPS display.
It does, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
so you end up with...
And it's been recapped as well.
Yeah, which, again, it would have to have been. But those new displays will mean better battery life. Battery technology has improved a lot anyway. I mean,
just your regular AA's are better now than the ones in the 90s. Yeah,
I was going with one of my Game Boys, the one that I just did as a restoration that was not upgraded, even with batteries in, they lasted, I think, like 9 months.
Wow, that's incredible.
Like with playing on it, every few days. Even now, like just earlier today, I picked it up and I've not played it in a few months. Still got juice in it. Still playing fine. So, it's doing a lot better. And then when you've got a better display in there than the power-hungry ones from the past, then that's going to help as well.
I mean, the backlight, if you open out a Game Gear, an original Game Gear, the backlight is ginormous.
Yeah.
That would suck a huge amount of power from those batteries. And now you don't need that with LCD IPS backlit, the pixels are what lights the screen effectively. You don't need a huge device behind the display shining a light on it effectively.
That's right.
You're reducing the power draw massively. Yeah, because like the display, if you don't count the original display, the CPU and the motherboard isn't drawing huge amounts of power on its own. It is the display and the backlight, the original backlight. Yeah.
I would say that if anybody's interested in replacing the display, probably your best port of call is Macho Nacho Productions.
He's amazing.
He's gone through so many different types of displays for the Game Gear, so he's a really good resource for that. There's also a guy, I'm going to butcher the name, I think it's like Mattis Nilwick. It's spelled Mathijs.
Yeah,
I think it's just pronounced Mattis. But he's come up with he basically reverse engineered the motherboard. So if your board is so damaged from leaked capacitors, where the traces are completely corroded through, you can actually order a completely new replacement board.
And just put the old chips on it. That's working. Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, so the fact it's all been reverse engineered and you can just, like, with a brand new part, it means that you can still get an old Game Gear working even if the capacitors have destroyed it, which is incredible. So definitely worth looking out for that as well. I know there's an interview with him on the Retro RGB channel.
Bob is awesome.
Yeah, so worth checking out that which because they're a podcast and they have a YouTube channel as well. So
we've had Bob from Retro RGB on Console Shock. So yeah, anybody listening, check that out. He's been on a couple of times. Al, check it out as well yourself.
I will do now. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But those are kind of the two resources there. The one thing that I there was one thing that I always wanted to have whenever I saw a Game Gear, and that was the TV tuner. I did have like a portable black and white television when I was a kid, which was incredible. It also was terrible at the same time because of the display technology at the time there with those.
And the antenna just would struggle to pick anything up.
But so it was a TV tuner that just slotted into the cartridge slot. The fact that it worked was incredible. And so, you just turned it into a portable TV that picked up analog signals. The problem now is there are no analog signals. So it's completely pointless and useless. In case you're wondering, that was being sold during the...
They marketed the crap out of it. I remember the adverts were talking about the TV tuner, and it was kind of Sega's kind of a big gotcha versus the Game Boy. Look, the screen's so good, you can watch normal TV on it, and that is a pretty cool feature to have, because
it was. I mean,
handheld TVs are expensive, standalone ones.
And it was £59. It was cheaper than the console itself, which makes sense.
And cheaper than a handheld TV, which would be probably about the same as a Game Gear. I would say £100. Yeah,
but for that's if you've already got a Game Gear, then that was such a better option than buying like a separate handheld portable TV. So £59 again back in '93 was £121 and 4 pence.
And I think there were bundles that came with the tuner as well, so that that might have knocked a few quid off. But yeah, they pushed it hard. And I never got it. Weirdly enough, I do remember getting like a handheld TV in the '90s at one point that I did use. But weirdly, it never twigged to me that I could just get the TV tuner for the Game Gear, and then basically have the same thing. I think TV probably would have looked half decent, but you would still have the issues with the ghosting and everything that you would get. Probably not so bad as a fast-moving video game. So yeah.
And the thing is that's what all of the handheld TVs were like back then, anyway. The fact that you get this color as well, because most of those were black and white anyway, because just the cost alone made them not really worth it. So as a handheld TV, it was an excellent option, and just the fact that Sega were doing that was kind of neat. It's kind of out there in the same way that Nintendo were doing with their pocket camera and the printer, where they were kind of coming up with these fun accessories that you just wouldn't have thought of for a handheld games console. And Sega were no different with the TV tuner.
Yeah, it was fairly quick. It wasn't like something that took years to come out as well. I think it was pretty much available as soon as the Game Gear was released in the UK. The TV tuner, so you could sort of pimp it out with the TV tuner straight away. I mean, getting back to the one that I've got, the sort of the modded one. There are other things as well. I mean, you touched upon the motherboard, sort of effectively having a new motherboard that you can put the old chips on. There's also lots of different coloured shells. So the one I've got is actually a red shell. You could get a red Game Gear in Japan back in the day. I don't think we ever got anything other than the black one.
Yeah, it was it was a Japanese exclusive.
That's right. In America, they did get a blue Game Gear that was like a sports edition that you got a couple of sports games
that
with.
That does not surprise me.
I don't know why blue is particularly associated with sports, but you could get that in America. We never got that variant, unfortunately. But yeah, now there's places to make cases, new screen lenses, as in the sort of the little module that you kind of place over the front of the unit that kind of goes over the actual the screen is actually behind the lens. And they're a bit better than the original lens because they're sort of flatter, and also the glass is sort of high quality and won't get scratched and all that stuff.
Yeah, well, the fact that it's glass instead of plastic. That's
exactly. Thing. So a lot more stronger and resistant. So it's got them different coloured buttons. And you can get other things that I didn't opt for. There are like USB-C charging modules that you can put in the battery bays, so you never have to worry about having batteries. To be honest, personally, again, I'm using it at home when I want to use it, and I just have like a USB to Game Gear power jack, so I could just sort of plug in like a Steam Deck USB-C or a power adapter or any kind of mobile phone one or whatever. And it will just plug into this little adapter that will then go into the Game Gear. So I haven't got to use an original Game Gear power supply, which is really good. And also the screen is obviously an IPS screen. Is light years ahead of what you had originally. Games no longer ghosting, not blurry. You have to get a good quality one to make sure it upscales well. Yeah, because you want to get one that will sort of do like an integer scale from the original screen resolutions. You haven't got slightly janky looking, disproportioned, graphics. So you have to look out for that, but yeah.
And the other benefit, I think, which is the biggest one, is the viewing angle that you get with these screens, because that's another thing that I forgot to mention, is that unless you're looking at it head on, like if you tilt it slightly, all your colors get washed out on the original display. The viewing angles were not forgiving.
Yeah, you have to be dead on with that. Yeah.
You still had a little bit of that with the Game Boy, but not to the degree of, and of course there wasn't really colors to really wash out. They would kind of go inverted depending on the angle. But yeah, with the Game Gear, it was atrocious. So that, again, with the display that you've got, it must look really sharp and great no matter how you're holding it.
Yeah, and it's sort of another residual sort of thing as well is we talked about earlier that you could play Master System games on the Game Gear. It was a little bit of a struggle playing them on the original Game Gear's display because obviously they were games designed for a large TV screen. So small text and things would come across very small on the Game Gear screen. It wasn't quite built for it. But now, obviously, with a modern display those sort of Master System games scale a lot better and are a lot easier to play. And you can even, with like a Game Gear EverDrive, you can just play the Game Gear ROMs and they'll just work obviously straight away on the Game Gear. So you don't have to plug in like a huge unit on the back and then stick a Master System game in there. So you could quite easily now play, the Master System version of Sonic 2 and not have the issues with the screen crunch. And you might have to, potentially not bother with the Game Gear versions that have, those screen crunch issues that happen in many games. So yeah, obviously they're super bright. You can also use the brightness knob that's on the side of the unit can be used to turn up the brightness on the new displays as well. So yeah, it's getting nigh on impossible now to really want to play on an original unit stock Game Gear. I've got a stock Game Gear that I've had for a long time. It isn't my original childhood one. That I think I traded that in a long time ago, back in the 90s. But I have a stock one that I've had for a long time. To be honest, I haven't turned it on. The caps have probably gone in that now. I probably should try and get it recapped just so it's not leaking all over itself.
Yeah, and always best to do that before trying to turn it on, because turning it on might be the death knell for it anyway.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, basically, any kids out there, make sure you've recapped your Game Gear. So yeah, that was our discussion about the Sega Game Gear. We hope you enjoyed it. I'm sure you've got your own thoughts as well. Feel free to reach out to us in the comments. Al, where can we find your stuff on the interwebs?
Well, I stream over on Twitch at twitch.tv/Alistair McFly. And that's pretty much it. I'm not really on social media anymore. I've kind of taken a step away from that. And
good idea.
That, possibly
everyone should.
Yeah. But I think that probably next time I come back, I might have more news about my new website that I'm launching, Alistair's Nostalgia Zone.
Oh wow!
Is what it's called. It's not live yet. It's but the end is near. I've gotten the majority of it all coded, and it's just a love letter to the internet of all, really. And so I hope that people enjoy it when it comes out, and I'm sure I'll have more news for that later on. But yeah, for now, you can watch me on Twitch play Minecraft with a bit of a Stargate twist.
Wow, that sounds awesome. And I've also heard a rumor that I think we do some kind of internet thing together at the moment that isn't Console Shock. Would you mind elaborating on that at all? Yeah.
Oh, right. Yes. From the far reaches of space, we use our long-range sensors to review old Star Trek episodes. So it's a great Star Trek retrospective podcast, long-range sensors. We also have a companion show as well, short-range sensors. So both we hope you check out if you are into Star Trek at all.
Yeah, and we semi-regularly we try and put out new shows on that, on long-range sensors, short-range sensors as well. So check out the websites there. We'll have a link in our description on here so you can have a look and see what we've posted on there. But thank you, Al, for coming on.
Thank you for having me as always.
No worries. And thank you, everybody, for listening, and we will catch you in the next one. Take care.
Ta-ta.